Next on our agenda would be Joseph. Joseph Gerson of the American Friends Service Committee. Joseph?
Actually, I'm not talking about the Robin Hood tax. I'm talking about the continuing nuclear dangers, nuclear weapons dangers. And let me begin by saying that looking around the room here, we have some people who have enough gray hair to remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, the dangers of the Reagan era, and some people who were part of a generation who really haven't dealt with nuclear issues. And just to appreciate that the U.S. strategic arsenal, the average power of about 7,000 of our nuclear weapons, about 20 times the size of the Hiroshima A-bomb. And to appreciate as well that on more than 30 occasions since Nagasaki, the United States has prepared and threatened to initiate nuclear war during international crises and wars. In fact, every other nuclear power in the world has made such threats at least once. I think we want to appreciate President Obama's speech in Prague, but the reality is that there's been very little follow-through, almost none. And to appreciate that the nuclear danger didn't end with the end of the Cold War. So just to repeat real quickly, we had with the 91 Gulf War, U.S. threats to initiate nuclear war against Iraq. During the Clinton administration, there were threats against Libya and Iraq, also North Korea in 1994. The second Bush administration, threats against Iraq, Iran, and Rumsfeld made a threat against Afghanistan. And even President Obama not only has had all options on the table in relationship to Iran, but during last March's crisis with North Korea, the United States flew simulated nuclear attacks against North Korea with B-2 and B-52 bombers. So it's very real. To appreciate the dangers here, the International Physicians for Prevention of Nuclear War in a study have said that even a small, quote-unquote, small exchange of about 100 Indian and Pakistani bombs would result minimally in the deaths of 1.5 billion people, not only those in the immediate blast areas, but with the fallout and the dust and everything coming up, the smoke would basically create cloud cover that would bring on a freeze, which would then result in famine around much of the world. The more recent studies indicate this is probably 2.5 billion people. The Red Cross has said, International Red Cross has said, that in the context of nuclear war, there's no way that they can provide adequate support. To appreciate the current moment, there was an article in, I think, Tuesday's China Daily. I know everybody here is an absolutely loyal reader of the China Daily. But it quoted Secretary of Defense Hagel in terms of the dangers of possible U.S.-Chinese war. Quoting from the article, it says, Defense Secretary Hagel on Tuesday said that regional tensions and conflicts in Asia-Pacific, the Middle East, and elsewhere continue to have the potential to erupt into larger-scale conflicts, drawing in the U.S., China, and Russia. And people should look particularly at names you've never heard of, the Diaoyu Senkaku Islands, uninhabited islands contested between Japan and China, and in the South China Sea. And to appreciate that just over a year ago, we almost went to war over those islands. Japan and China, very intense conflict, increasingly militarizing it, and both the U.S. Congress and the Obama administration said that should it come to war, the United States would come in on Japan's side. We're now in a situation where Japan is moving to fly drones over those islands, and the Chinese have said if they shoot their the Chinese going to put the drones over there. If the Japanese shoot them down, that's an act of war, and then we're on. Also, just to appreciate, I spoke at the United Nations high-level meeting on nuclear disarmament in September. This was heads of state, foreign ministers, and ambassadors from around the world. And little reported in the United States is just how isolated the United States is and just how little we're doing. So in that context, ironically, almost the majority of the nations identified with the resolutions put forward by the non-aligned movement. The greatest concerns that were raised were the failure of the United States to implement its part of the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, which is to move toward negotiations for the comprehensive abolition of nuclear weapons. And, if you will, more urgently, more recently, the failure to convene or co-convene the Conference for Middle East Nuclear Weapons and Weapons of Mass Destruction Free Zone in 2012. The United States made a commitment to do this during the NPT review in 2010, and the failure to implement it could lead to the absolute collapse of the NPT. And if that goes, you're going to see absolute global proliferation of nuclear weapons. I mean, two more analytical points and then elements that people can follow up on. We should appreciate that in part of the deal to win ratification of the New START treaty, and New START was only really important in terms of maintaining a system of verification with Russia. President Obama committed to massive increases in spending for both nuclear weapons and for their delivery systems. The New York Times estimates the cost at between $300 billion and $1 trillion. This is while we're shutting down hospitals, schools, WIC, all kinds of essential human needs, and of course making the world much more dangerous and encouraging other nations to follow suit. We're spending things for as well modernization of the B-61 bomb, which the Europeans want out, and there's actually legislation to get rid of it here. So these are all things I think are of great and immediate concern. If you look at what's going on in China, look what's going on in Japan, intense nationalism, the kind of environment in which political leaders themselves have to follow public opinion at times rather than lead it. And when you're in a crisis over something like the Diaoyu Sakako Islands, it's the kind of thing that can get out of hand and lead to war. And it's been compared to 1914, and we're just on the 100th anniversary of the beginning of the First World War. So what are some things that people can do to support here? I think one is to support the Holmes-Norton bill for abolition and economic conversion, and to think that we're not going to win it now, but as Bob Borisage says in his recent article, we need to be building the platform for the future, and I think getting behind that is one way to do that. I think we have to be pressing the Obama administration that it's absolutely necessary to move to convene the Middle East Nuclear Weapons and WMD Free Zone Conference in Helsinki. This is of absolute urgent importance to kill the B-61. And following one of the things that took place, again not reported in the United States, as the General Assembly opened, they passed two resolutions of critical importance. In one, 125 nations, including Japan, which is under the U.S. nuclear umbrella, all voted that nuclear weapons should not be used under any condition at all. And this was followed by 2/3 of the world's nations voting that the negotiations for the complete elimination of nuclear weapons required by the NPT, required by the International Court of Justice, should begin in 2014. These are all things that we need to be putting on our agenda because what we're dealing with here is the survival of the human race. And we've got climate change and we have nuclear weapons. With the end of the Cold War, people forgot about it, thought the danger went away. The truth is it didn't. We need to be doing the education. We need to be doing the outreach. We need to be talking about the conversion. We need to be doing what's important if our children, grandchildren are to survive. Thank you.
Okay, Joe, can you give us a quick overview of your background?
My background. In 1964, I went to college thinking I wanted to be both a freedom rider and a diplomat. So I went to Georgetown, and one of my classmates was a guy named Bill Clinton. I decided I couldn't be a diplomat for a country that was fighting a war in Vietnam, and so I went into the civil rights movement and then the peace movement, and been doing that ever since. What more to say? We helped to launch the nuclear weapons freeze movement in basically 1979. In Boston, we had to fight a struggle against both Senator Kennedy and now Secretary of Defense Kerry. I'm sorry to say, they took the bait from Reagan, wanted to turn Boston into a nuclear weapons base. And we had the operations officer from the Atlantic Fleet, former operations officer, come up and give really important testimony about the Navy's history of nuclear weapons accidents. I've been working with Japanese and other Asian and European peace movements about forever. Work closely with A-bomb survivors, have brought delegations not only of Japanese A-bomb survivors, we have about 1 million here in the United States between our downwinders, just absolutely sacrificed to the pursuit of nuclear superiority. Atomic veterans who were purposely exposed to fallout so that the military could know how troops would respond in a condition of nuclear warfighting, and some of the people who work in the nuclear weapons plants. I do work, as I've been doing exchanges with some figures in China, on the board of the International Peace Bureau, so I keep busy.
And I also noticed that you're an author of Empire and the Bomb. Looks very interesting. A little scary, but interesting.
Just to say this is basically a history of the U.S. use of nuclear weapons, beginning with Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but then moving through the Bush administration and providing the really sorry, unhappy, frightening detail of more than 30 occasions when our government prepared and threatened to initiate nuclear war. You know, when you do this, it takes you into a very dark understanding of the nature of the state. But when a state is a global empire, and when you have a military that's rolling your president, as it did in Afghanistan, you need to understand that you know this is the world we live in, and if we're going to change the world, we need to understand the world that we occupy.